Most people think power looks like money or control, but sometimes it looks like silence. The restaurant was wrapped in soft golden light, crystal glasses catching reflections like tiny stars, and at the center of it all sat Daniel Hayes, a billionaire who had built a $2.3 billion empire before turning 40. His tailored suit perfect, his Swiss watch ticking with quiet authority as he reviewed a deal that could shift markets by morning. For him, everything was calculated, predictable, controlled, until it wasn't. Across the room, Emily Carter moved between tables with quiet precision, her black and white uniform simple, her posture calm, her eyes noticing things no one else did, the way a man tapped his fingers too fast, the way a couple avoided eye contact, the way tension could sit in a room before anyone spoke it aloud. She had been working double shifts for weeks, yet nothing in her movements suggested exhaustion, only a kind of stillness that didn't belong in a place driven by urgency and noise. Daniel barely noticed her at first. To him, she was part of the background, efficient, invisible, exactly how the world arranged itself around people like him. But something about the way she paused for half a second at each table, as if reading more than orders, lingered just beyond his awareness. Then the shift happened, subtle at first, like a drop in temperature you couldn't quite explain, conversations thinning, laughter fading, attention threading its way through the room without a sound. Daniel looked up, instinctively, the way he always did when something fell off, but for the first time in years, he didn't immediately understand what he was looking at. A man stood near the entrance, his posture tight, his voice controlled but uneven, and while no one moved, everyone felt it, that invisible line between normal and something else had already been crossed. A glass trembled in someone's hand, a chair scraped too softly against the floor, and suddenly the entire room was holding its breath. Daniel's mind raced through scenarios, risk, exit routes, security response times, but his body stayed still, caught in a rare moment where logic didn't translate into action, where control slipped just enough to feel unfamiliar. And then, without warning, his focus shifted, not to the man at the door, but to Emily. She wasn't frozen. She wasn't panicked. She wasn't even looking at the tension the way everyone else was. She was watching him, really watching him, like she saw something deeper than the moment unfolding, her hands steady, her breathing unchanged, as if the world hadn't tilted at all. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. And then she took one small step forward, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to change the center of gravity in the room. And in that quiet movement, Daniel felt something he had never felt before in any boardroom, any negotiation, any billion-dollar decision. He realized, with a clarity that unsettled him, that the most important thing about to happen in that room had nothing to do with money, power, or control, and everything to do with the quiet waitress no one had been paying attention to. The room did not explode into chaos. It folded into silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every small movement feel louder than it should be. And Daniel realized that for the first time in his life, he was not the one setting the tone. The man near the entrance spoke again, his voice tight, uncertain, as if he expected resistance but found none. And that uncertainty hung in the air like a question no one wanted to answer, while Daniel's mind kept calculating distances, timing, outcomes, yet his body stayed still, unfamiliar with a situation that could not be solved with money or authority. And then Emily moved again. It was not fast. It was not dramatic. It was deliberate. One step, then another, her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present, and that presence shifted something invisible in the room. People who had been frozen began to breathe again, not loudly, but enough to remind themselves they were still there. Daniel watched her, trying to understand what she was doing, what she knew that everyone else did not, because she was not reacting to fear the way the rest of them were. She was responding to something deeper, something he could not see. The man's voice rose slightly, not in anger, but in confusion, as if her calm disrupted the script he had expected to follow. And Emily stopped a few feet away, close enough to be heard without raising her voice, far enough to keep space between them. And when she spoke, it was almost a whisper, soft, steady, measured like someone who understood the weight of every word. Daniel could not hear the exact sentence, not at first, but he saw the effect, the way the man's shoulders shifted, the way his grip eased, the way his eyes flickered with something that looked less like control and more like recognition. It was subtle, almost invisible, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Emily did not move closer. She did not rush. She simply stood there, holding the moment in place, as if time itself had slowed around her, and Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the realization that he was watching something he could not explain with logic or strategy. He had spent his entire life mastering systems, predicting behavior, controlling outcomes, but this was different. This was human in a way his world rarely allowed, and he found himself leaning forward slightly, not to act but to witness. The man spoke again, quieter this time, his voice losing its sharp edge, and Emily responded with the same calm tone, the same steady rhythm, as if she were guiding him back to something he had almost forgotten. Around them, the room remained still, but the tension had shifted, no longer sharp and suffocating, but fragile, like a thread that could either break or be gently rewoven. Daniel glanced around and realized something that unsettled him more than anything else. No one was looking at the man anymore. They were all looking at her, at the waitress who had stepped into a moment no one else understood. And for the first time in years, Daniel Hayes, the man who controlled billion-dollar decisions with a single call, was not thinking about what to do next. He was waiting to see what she would do. The moment did not break. It deepened, like a breath held too. Long finally finding rhythm again, and Daniel could feel it in the room. That fragile shift from fear to something quieter, something steadier, all anchored by a woman no one had noticed 10 minutes ago. Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving the man's face, not judging, not demanding, just seeing. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a different weight, not softer, not louder, but more certain, as if she had already decided how this would end. The man's fingers twitched, not tightening, not loosening, just uncertain, caught between instinct and something unfamiliar rising beneath it. And Daniel realized that uncertainty was the first crack in control, the first place where change could enter. Emily did not rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let him sit in it. And in that space, something shifted again, his shoulders dropping just slightly, his breathing evening out, as if he were remembering how to be present instead of reactive. Daniel's pulse slowed without him realizing it, his mind no longer racing through outcomes, but narrowing in on the exchange unfolding in front of him. Because this was no longer about danger, it was about understanding, about a quiet negotiation happening without contracts, without numbers, without power in the way he had always defined it. Emily took one more small step, careful, measured, her movements never threatening, and she said something that Daniel could finally hear, a single sentence, simple, almost ordinary, but it landed with a weight that changed everything, because she was not speaking to what the man was doing, she was speaking to who he was beneath it, and that difference mattered more than anything else in that moment. The man blinked once, twice, as if the words had reached somewhere deeper than he expected, and his posture shifted again, not in surrender, not in defeat, but in recognition, like someone being reminded of a version of themselves they had almost forgotten existed. Around them, the room remained still, but the silence no longer felt suffocating, it felt intentional, like everyone was witnessing something they did not fully understand, but knew was important. Daniel felt it then, a realization settling into him with a quiet certainty that made him uncomfortable, because for all his experience, all his success, all his control, he would not have known what to say, he would not have known how to stand there, how to hold that moment without forcing it, without breaking it. And yet she did, effortlessly, naturally, as if this was not an extraordinary situation, but simply another moment to be handled with care. The man's hand lowered just a fraction, enough to change the balance of the room, enough for the tension to loosen its grip on everyone present, and Emily did not react with relief or triumph. She remained steady, as if she had expected this all along. Daniel watched her, truly watched her now, not as background, not as service, but as something else entirely, something he could not yet define, but knew he could not ignore. And in that quiet, unfolding moment, Daniel Hayes understood something that no boardroom, no negotiation, no billion-dollar deal had ever taught him. That real power was not about control over others. It was about the ability to see them clearly, and in that realization, he knew that whatever happened next, he would not walk away from this the same person. The shift was almost invisible, but once it happened, it changed everything, the man's arm lowering just enough for the room to exhale in quiet relief. Not all at once, but slowly, like people remembering how to breathe after holding it for too long. And Emily did not step back. She did not celebrate. She simply stayed where she was, grounded, steady, as if the moment was not over yet. As if she understood that calm was not something you reached once, but something you maintained. Daniel watched the subtle transformation unfold. The way the man's eyes softened, the way his stance lost its rigid edge, and for the first time, Daniel noticed something he had completely missed before. This was not about control. It was about connection, about one person choosing to see another beyond the surface of a situation that everyone else only reacted to. Emily spoke again, her tone unchanged, still calm, still deliberate, but there was a quiet reassurance in it now. Something that did not command, but invited, and the man responded, not with words at first, but with a small nod, almost hesitant, as if he was not used to being understood, as if he was unsure how to accept it. Around them, the restaurant remained still, but the tension had transformed into something else, something fragile but hopeful, like a moment balanced between two outcomes, and everyone present knew they were witnessing the difference between escalation and resolution, between reaction and intention. Daniel felt his perspective shift in real time, the way it sometimes did during rare turning points in business, except this was deeper, more personal, less about winning and more about understanding, and it unsettled him in a way he could not ignore. He had spent years building systems that responded to pressure with force, strategies that countered risk with dominance. But here, none of that applied. Here, a quiet presence and a few carefully chosen words had accomplished what power never could. The man took a slow step back, not forced, not pushed, but chosen, and that single step felt larger than any move Daniel had ever orchestrated in a boardroom. Because it was not about leverage, it was about trust, something Daniel realized he had rarely considered outside of transactions. Emily finally allowed a small breath to escape, barely noticeable, but enough to signal that the moment had shifted from fragile to stable. And still, she did not rush. She did not turn away. She stayed present until the last trace of tension dissolved from the room. Daniel's eyes followed her every movement now, not out of curiosity alone, but out of recognition, because something in him had already begun to change, something he had not planned, something he could not quantify. And for a man who built his life on certainty, that realization was both unsettling and undeniable. The man near the entrance lowered his gaze, no longer the center of the room, no longer the force that had defined the moment. And in that quiet transition, the balance of power shifted completely, not to Daniel, not to anyone with status or wealth, but to the woman who had never raised her voice, never, demanded attention, and yet had changed everything. And as the room slowly returned to life, conversations resuming in hushed tones, movements cautious but steady, Daniel Hayes remained still, watching Emily as she turned slightly, her expression unchanged, her posture the same as it had always been, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. And in that contrast, Daniel understood something that would stay with him long after this night ended. That true influence does not announce itself. It reveals itself quietly in moments when everything else falls away. The room slowly returned to motion, but not to normal. Not yet, because something had shifted beneath the surface, something people could not name, but could feel in the way their voices stayed lower, in the way their movements carried a new kind of awareness. And at the center of it all, Emily simply turned back toward her duties, as if the moment had been nothing more than another table to tend. Daniel did not move. He remained seated, his hand resting on the edge of the table, his untouched glass reflecting the soft light above. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the deal in front of him. Not thinking about numbers or outcomes or leverage. He was thinking about her. The man near the entrance had stepped aside now, no longer the focus, his presence fading into the background like a shadow losing its shape, and others began to quietly guide the situation toward calm resolution. But Daniel barely registered it, because his attention was fixed entirely on Emily Carter. She moved with the same quiet precision as before, picking up a tray, adjusting a glass, offering a soft reassurance to a nearby guest, her expression composed, her breathing steady, as if nothing about the last few minutes had been extraordinary, as if she had not just held an entire room together with nothing but her presence and a few carefully chosen words. Daniel stood slowly, not out of urgency, but out of something deeper, a need to understand, to close the distance between what he had just witnessed and what he thought he knew about the world. And as he approached her, he noticed details he had missed. Before, the slight wear on her shoes, the faint crease in her sleeve from long hours, the calm focus in her eyes that did not seek attention, did not expect recognition. Emily glanced up as he neared, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without curiosity, simply acknowledging him as another person in the room. Nothing more, nothing less, and that alone unsettled him more than anything else had that night. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft but clear, not deferential, not impressed, just present. And for a moment, Daniel did not answer, because he realized he did not have the language for what he was feeling, not in the way he usually did, not in metrics or outcomes or strategic terms. "I think I am," he said finally, the words unfamiliar in their honesty, and Emily nodded once, as if that was enough, as if she did not need anything more from him. No gratitude, no acknowledgement, no validation. She turned slightly, ready to continue her work, and something in Daniel resisted that, not out of entitlement, but out of recognition that if he let this moment pass without understanding it, he would lose something important, something rare. "You knew what to say," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, and Emily paused, just for a fraction of a second, before looking back at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady. "No," she replied gently. "I just listened." The simplicity of the answer settled into him with a weight he could not ignore, because it challenged everything he had built his life on, every assumption about influence and control and power. And in that moment, standing in a restaurant that was slowly returning to its rhythm, Daniel Hayes understood that what he had witnessed was not luck, not instinct alone, but something far more deliberate, something learned, something chosen. And as Emily stepped away, disappearing once again into the quiet flow of service, Daniel remained where he was, his mind no longer on the deal that had seemed so important hours ago, but on a single realization that refused to leave him, that the most powerful move he had ever seen was not made in a boardroom, not backed by money or authority, but spoken softly, in a moment when no one else knew what to do, by someone the world had almost ignored. Daniel did not sit back down, even as the room slowly found its rhythm again, even as glasses were refilled and conversations cautiously resumed, because something in him refused to return to what had existed before those few minutes. Something had shifted too deeply to ignore, and for the first time in a long time, he did not reach for his phone, did not check the deal waiting on a screen, did not calculate what came next. Instead, he watched. Emily moved from table to table, her pace steady, her voice calm, her presence unchanged, as if the moment that had just altered the entire room had never belonged to her in the first place. And that was what unsettled him most. Not what she had done, but how easily she let it go. Daniel had built his life on moments like that, on decisions that changed outcomes, on actions that demanded recognition. Yet she carried none of it, no trace of urgency, no expectation of acknowledgement, just quiet continuation. He stepped back toward his table slowly, his mind replaying every second, every word, every pause, trying to understand what had actually happened, because it was not strategy, not in the way he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that operated outside the frameworks he trusted. The deal on his tablet still glowed in front of him, numbers waiting, signatures pending, but for the first time, it felt distant, almost irrelevant, and that realization landed heavier than he expected, because it meant something had just outranked everything he thought mattered. Across the room, Emily paused briefly near the entrance, speaking quietly with someone, her posture relaxed, her tone even, and Daniel noticed something he had not seen before. The way people responded to her, not with obligation, not with formality, but with a kind of trust that was immediate and unspoken, as if they recognized something in her that did not need explanation. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting into something clearer, something closer to understanding, and without fully deciding to. He reached for his phone, not to check the deal, but to open the camera. He did not announce it. He did not stand or make a scene. He simply lifted it slightly, capturing the quiet aftermath, the way the room moved differently now, the way people looked at her, the way she remained unchanged in the center of it all. And for once, he was not thinking about exposure or branding or influence. He was thinking about truth. The recording lasted only a few seconds, but it held something he could not define, something he knew others needed to see. Not the moment of tension, not the fear, but the calm that had followed, the quiet power that had reshaped everything without force. He lowered the phone, staring at the screen for a moment longer than necessary, then looked back up at her, and in that simple action, a decision formed, not calculated, not strategic, but certain. This would not stay in this room. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was unusual, but because it revealed something real, something people had forgotten how to recognize. Emily turned slightly, moving toward another table, unaware of what he had just done, unaware that the moment she had already moved past was about to move far beyond these walls. And Daniel Hayes, a man who had built his reputation on controlling narratives, understood that this time he was not creating one. He was simply choosing not to let it disappear. The restaurant eventually returned to what it was supposed to be, or at least something close to it. But Daniel knew it was not the same. Not really, because once you see something clearly, you cannot pretend you did not. And as he sat back down, the glow of his phone still in his hand, he looked at the short clip he had captured. Just a few seconds, no dramatic angle, no perfect framing, just Emily standing there, calm, steady, present, while everything else adjusted around her. And somehow, that simplicity carried more weight than any polished content he had ever seen. He did not edit it. He did not add music. He did not even rewatch it more than once. He simply opened his private account, the one followed by millions, and typed 3 words before pausing, his fingers hovering over the screen, because for the first time, he was not thinking about engagement, not thinking about reach. He was thinking about honesty, about whether he could present this moment without distorting it, without turning it into something it was not. After a long second, he erased the words and replaced them with something simpler, something that felt closer to what he had actually witnessed. And then he posted it. No explanation, no context, just the clip. The reaction did not happen immediately, not in the loud, explosive way people expected from viral moments, but in something quieter, something slower, like a ripple moving outward before anyone realized it had started. Within minutes, the comments began, first confusion, then curiosity, then something deeper, people asking the same question in different ways. Who is she? What did she say? How did she stay like that? And Daniel found himself reading them, not as a creator monitoring response, but as someone searching for answers alongside everyone else. Across the room, Emily continued working, unaware, untouched by the digital storm beginning to build beyond those walls. And that contrast only made the moment more powerful, because the world was about to see something she had already let go of. Daniel's phone buzzed softly, notifications stacking one after another, messages from colleagues, from media contacts, from people who rarely reached out unless something mattered, but he did not respond. Not yet, because he was still trying to understand his own decision, still try to process why this felt different from every other move he had made in his career. He glanced up at her again, watching as she placed a glass of water in front of a guest, her expression unchanged, her focus complete, and he realized something that made him pause. This moment did not belong to him. Not really, it belonged to her, to the choice she had made, to the calm she had carried into a space that needed it. and all he had done was refuse to let it disappear. The notifications kept coming, faster now, louder, the ripple turning into something undeniable, and Daniel knew what would happen next. The calls, the headlines, the attempts to frame the story into something easy to consume, something dramatic, something simplified, but he also knew that none of that would capture what he had actually seen, what had actually happened in that quiet exchange. He leaned back slightly, the weight of the evening settling into something clearer, something more grounded. And for the first time since he had built his empire, he felt less interested in controlling the narrative and more interested in protecting its truth. Across the room, Emily turned briefly, her gaze sweeping the space in that same quiet, observant way. And for a fraction of a second, their eyes met again, not as billionaire and waitress, not as observer and subject, but simply as two people who had shared a moment that neither of them would ever fully forget, even if the rest of the world was just beginning to notice. The ripple did not stop. It expanded, quietly at first, and then all at once, like something the world had been waiting to recognize. And Daniel could see it happening in real time as his phone continued to vibrate against the table, notifications stacking faster than he could read them. Messages from people who rarely reacted to anything, now asking the same question in different ways, not about him, not about the situation, but about her. And still, across the room, Emily remained unchanged. She carried a tray to a nearby table, her steps measured, her expression calm, her focus on the people in front of her, not on the invisible wave building beyond the walls. And that contrast grew sharper with every passing second. The louder the world became, the quieter she seemed. Daniel opened the post again, watching the view count climb, thousands, then tens of thousands, then more, but what held him was not the numbers, it was the comments, people replaying the same few seconds, noticing details he had not even considered, the steadiness of her hands, the way she held eye contact, the absence of fear, and beneath all of it, a single thread repeating over and over again. How did she do that? He leaned back slightly, exhaling as if the question had been directed at him, but he knew the answer was not something he could give, because what he had seen was not a technique, not a trick, it was something deeper, something earned through experiences he could only guess at. A message appeared at the top of his screen from someone he respected, someone who rarely commented on anything outside of business. And the words were simple, "That is real leadership." And Daniel felt the weight of that statement settle into him, because it challenged everything he had been taught about what leadership looked like, everything he had practiced, everything he had believed. He glanced up again, watching Emily as she paused briefly near a table where an older couple sat, her voice soft, reassuring, her presence grounding in a way that seemed to extend beyond the moment. And he realized that what she had done earlier was not an exception. It was a pattern, a way of moving through the world that most people never noticed because they were too focused on louder forms of power. The room had fully returned to motion now, plates clinking, conversations rebuilding, but there was a difference, subtle but undeniable. People looked at her differently, not with admiration alone, but with awareness, as if they had seen something they could not unsee, something that shifted how they understood presence, calm, and strength. Daniel's phone buzzed again, a call this time, then another, and another, but he ignored them all, his attention still anchored in the space in front of him because he knew something that the outside world did not yet understand. This story was incomplete. They had seen the moment, the surface, the visible shift, but they had not seen the why, the history behind it, the quiet path that had shaped someone into who she was, and that realization stayed with him, growing stronger with every second. Emily turned slightly, adjusting a glass, her movements as precise as ever, and for a brief moment, the noise of the digital world felt distant compared to the clarity of the physical one, compared to the simple truth standing just a few feet away. Daniel lowered his phone, resting on the table, and made a decision that had nothing to do with views, nothing to do with attention, but everything to do with understanding, because he knew that if the world was going to watch, then they needed more than a moment. They needed the story behind it, the quiet truth that could not be captured in a few seconds of video. And as the numbers continued to rise beyond his control, Daniel Hayes realized that the most important part of what had just begun was not what people were seeing, but what they were still missing. Daniel did not make the call right away. Even as his phone continued to light up, even as the world outside that restaurant began turning a quiet moment into something far larger than he had intended. Because for once, he understood that timing was not about speed, it was about clarity, and clarity was something he was only beginning to grasp. He looked up again, finding Emily exactly where she had been moments before, not physically, but in presence, grounded, attentive, fully engaged with the person in front of her. And it struck him that while millions of people were now watching her image on a screen, none of them were actually seeing what he had seen. None of them were close enough to understand what made that moment real. He stood slowly, not drawing attention, not announcing his movement, and walked toward her again, each step quieter than the last, as if he did not want to disturb something that was still unfolding in ways he could not fully explain. When he reached her, she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his with the same calm awareness, no curiosity about his status, no reaction to the fact that his phone was still buzzing with a world that now knew a fraction of her story, just a simple acknowledgement of another human being standing in front of her. "Emily," he said, her name steady in his voice now, not as a question, but as recognition, and she nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, simply present. He paused, searching for the right words, and for the first time in a long time, he did not default to certainty. He allowed the pause to exist, allowed himself to feel the weight of what he was about to say. "They are watching you," he said quietly, lifting his phone just enough to show the screen, the numbers climbing, the comments multiplying, the world reacting to. Something she had already moved past, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not excitement, but something closer to distance, like someone who understood attention but did not belong to it. She looked at the screen, then back at him, and her response came without hesitation, without calculation, as if the answer had always been there waiting. "They are not watching me," she said softly. "They are watching a moment." The words settled into him with a clarity that cut through everything else, because they reframed the entire situation in a way he had not considered, in a way that removed ego, removed ownership, and left only truth. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, the weight of it different now, not as a tool of influence, but as a window that had captured something it could not fully contain, and in that realization, his next decision became simple. He turned the screen off, silencing the noise for the first time since it had begun, and looked back at her, not as someone with power offering opportunity, but as someone who had just learned something he could not ignore. "Then I think they deserve to understand it," he said, his voice quieter than it had ever been in any deal, any negotiation, any moment that had defined his career, and Emily studied him for a brief second, her gaze steady, as if measuring not his words, but his intention. She did not agree immediately. She did not refuse. She simply held the silence, the same way she had held the room earlier, allowing the moment to settle into something real before responding. Around them, the restaurant continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that something larger was being decided in a space no louder than a conversation. And after a few seconds, she gave a small nod, not as permission, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that understanding required more than observation. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of the evening finally settling into something he could carry, not as a story to control, but as a truth to protect. And as he stepped back, giving her space once more, he realized that what had gone viral was not the calm itself, not the moment of tension, but the reminder. That real strength does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be present when everything else falls apart, and that was something no camera could fully capture, only witness.